So we're going to keep on moving on our program today. Thank you, Dr. Roldan Figueroa, for such an incredible presentation. And it's really curious, I mean, the connections between a Czech architect trained in Chicago with the influence of the Chicago School. And of course, there's some things that I would love to ask you as well, but Antonin Negodoma is such an interesting character. But the connections with Puerto Rico as the site of his work is really important as well. So moving on, we're gonna have now Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown. She's an associate professor of medieval history from the University of Chicago. And she's gonna be presenting to us the Crystal Palace of Christ, a meditation on Marian architecture. Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown.
Wow, so I can't see you, which I find strange. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So yes, everybody else, come back in and sit down. I'm told to pause.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I would love to acknowledge the presence of Miss Didier, widow and spouse of Mr. James Didier. Thank you for coming in. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but she told us that she wanted to come here to listen to your presentation, so.
Thank you, I'm honored. And thank you all for having me. Edgardo gave me a very brief introduction, but I'll say to you, I aim to spark discussion, so we'll do it. I invite you to think about glass, particularly stained glass windows. Thanks to modern glass technology, we tend to think of windows as something to look through, and of glass as something to put on the outside of buildings so that they reflect the sky. We see windows as enabling us to focus on the exterior world rather than on the building we are inside. But stained glass neither lets us look outside, as witnessed, nor can we see it from the outside. To see the glass in its glory, we have to go inside the building and let the sunlight come in through the glass. This should make us thoughtful about the purpose and meaning of stained or colored glass as we experience it in churches. Stained glass is particularly associated with medieval styles of church architecture, most notably what we now call Gothic, but which, in the period in which it was new, was known as the French style, Opus Franciganum, famously inaugurated in the mid-12th century by Abbot Suger at the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis. Now, I should say, I'm showing you mainly images from Saint-Denis and Chartres in this lecture. I also have a few interlopers from Arnstein, but I'm mainly showing you images from, this is Suger's famous chevet, the little chapel ring, mainly showing you images from Saint-Denis and from Chartres. So if you're wondering what you're looking at, those are the buildings. I'm also trying to show you 12th century glass, but as with, so go back, the great choir at Saint-Denis, it's been rebuilt, so these are not, in fact, the original ones necessarily that Suger is talking about. So we're talking about the French style, we're talking about Saint-Denis and Chartres, And I'm trying to talk to you about the 12th century, but there's some interlopers. A second caveat, and I'm getting used to the fact that I can't see you, which I find strange, is that when I say stained glass, I'm actually talking about, that's a slight misnomer. Technically, 12th century glass is more accurately described as pot metal glass or painted glass. Technically, stained glass, glass painted with a silver stain that turns yellow when it's fired, was only developed in the 14th century. And so this slide is showing you, this is, whoops, I'm going to get used to this too. There. This is showing you some of the old glass. This is a window in Chicago, and if you recognize it, I know you go to Mass. Okay, so we're talking about painted glass. Stained glass is not really part of this discussion, but you'll think about it as stained glass because that's what you're used to hearing about it. Up to the end of the 13th century, glass was colored in the mass, meaning that the metallic oxides that served as the colorants were added to different batches of the molten silicate mixture while they were still in their cooking pots. And this is an example both from Saint-Denis and from Arnstein of some of this 12th century glass. And you can see how rich the colors are as they're cooked into the glass itself. However, just as this is not technically stained glass but pot metal glass, neither is this pot metal glass a new invention of the 12th century, even for use in windows. So I'm saying it's 12th century glass, but this kind of glass technology is in fact older. We have churches from the Carolingian period, several hundred years prior to this, that are known to have had pictorial glass windows, but only fragments of these early windows survive. So when we're talking about stained glass windows from the Middle Ages, and there's all these caveats here, we're mainly talking about 12th century glass and why it becomes the glass that you associate most with church architecture. Something significant changed in the 12th century, but it wasn't necessarily in the making of glass. Arguably, the most significant change in the making of glass was contemporary with the birth of Christ, which I shall argue should also make us thoughtful about what glass means. What does glass mean? Well, to the delight and frustration of historians of medieval art and architecture, Abbot Suger at Saint-Denis did more than just commission new windows for the chevet and choir of his church. He also left an account of what he thought they meant. There are, in fact, two different accounts. One is on the consecration of the new choir in June 1144, and the other is on Suger's administration of his abbey. You think the one is a description of the ceremony that he has for dedicating this new building, or this newly constructed building. The building had been there for longer. He's rebuilding it. And the other is a justification of all the money he spent. Both include details about the building program. However, comparatively full as they are for a description of a medieval program of building, Suger's accounts are nevertheless somewhat riddling about his purpose. For example, on the windows. And to say he did the windows, and he's very famous for the windows, and if you have courses on medieval church architecture, you can hear about Saint-Denis and the windows. Suger also did other ornaments in the church, and in the consecration and on the administration, he describes all of those. So I'm just focusing on the windows, but he does talk about other elements in the buildings. But we're thinking about glass, and we're thinking about what he said about the windows. So, for example, on the windows, in the De Consecratione, he explains that he had proposed to build, quote, a circular string of chapels, by virtue of which the whole church would shine with the wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows pervading the interior beauty. He's talking about this circular string of chapels in circuitu oratorium incremento quod tota clarissimarum vitrearum luce mirabili et continua interiorem perlustrante pulchritudinem initeret. The important words there are the glass, the vitrearum. He's building with this clearest glass, and it's going to shine with beauty. Except for you're looking at some of the glass from those chapels, and they're not exactly clear, at least in the way in which we tend to think about glass. They're very deeply colored and dark. So what does he mean that they're shining with this light, and why is he so interested in that light element? In his account of the administration, he describes the windows themselves in somewhat more detail, including some of the images that he placed on them, but only in part. And this is where it gets very frustrating for art historians, that he describes some of the program of the symbolism, but not all of it. So it's like, does this all apply to all the windows, just some of them? What was he thinking? He says that the series of windows that he had commissioned were, quote, very valuable on account of their wonderful execution and the profuse expenditure of painted glass and sapphire glass. The two potentially technical terms there, vitri vestiti, clothed glass. I mean, we usually translate that as painted glass. What does he mean by that? And saphiorum materia, sapphire matter material. Suger considered that these windows were so precious that he specified in his account of how he's spending his money that he had appointed a master craftsman for their protection and repair. You don't get architecture. I've been hearing about your architecture building. You don't get architecture without also having to have the upkeep, right? And so he was making sure that he had appointed people to take care of this new building. So intriguing, giving you some indication of what he thought he was doing, but not necessarily as complete as, well, we would like to now understand. And so there's been a profusion of scholarly suggestions about what Suger hoped to achieve. The most famous is Erwin Panofsky's, who edited and translated both of these accounts of the administration and the consecration ceremonies. And so if you want to read the actual accounts, we have them in the Latin, but Panofsky did a translation. And therefore, his suggestion of what Suger was up to has been fairly significant in the scholarly discussion. For Panofsky, what he saw was, well, this church, which Suger is the abbot for, had a very interesting dedication. I've been saying Saint Denis as if you know who that is. Saint Denis, Saint Denis, was considered, he's the patron of the royal family. This chapel has a number of the tombs of the kings of France. But in the period, in the Middle Ages, Saint Denis was believed to have been, one, the acquaintance of St. Paul, and two, the author of a very famous account of the angelic hierarchies, the celestial hierarchies. And these are two different people, in fact. The Dionysius the Areopagite, who knew Paul, and the Saint Denis, whose account we have of the celestial hierarchies. The Saint Denis, who made the account of the celestial hierarchies, was very interested in light. He was also a Neoplatonist, so when he thinks about light, he thinks about it in this elaborate metaphysical understanding. And Panofsky took these two things, put them together, and said, aha, that is clearly what Suger is up to. This is about a metaphysics, a light metaphysics. More particularly, what Panofsky suggests is what we see in Suger's account of his windows and his construction of these windows is, quote, an orgy of Neoplatonic light metaphysics. You didn't know you were getting an orgy today, right? You get an orgy of Neoplatonic light metaphysics. Specifically, this anagogical transition from the inferior world of matter and the sort of visible creation to a higher world of understanding, intellect, contemplation. This anagogy of light, Panofsky famously argued, was what Suger was aiming at. And he pointed in his discussion to a number of other places in Suger's account of what he thought he was doing in the church to the focus that Suger gave on light. For example, the verses that Suger wrote to describe the gilded bronze doors carrying images of the passion and resurrection of Christ. And this is Suger's verses explaining what he thought he was doing with gilded bronze on the doors. Quote, whoever thou art, if thou seekest to extol the glory of these doors, marvel not at the gold and the expense, but of the craftsmanship of the work. Bright is the noble work, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten the minds so that they may travel through the true lights to the true light where Christ is the true door. I've seen a seal here. You all think about Christ as the light of the world a lot, so you should get doors like this. Travel through the true lights to the true light where Christ is the true door. In what manner it be inherent in this world, the golden door defines. The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion. This description that Sujet gives, and it's throughout both the consecration and the administration, that he's constantly talking about the meaning of the shining quality of the work that he's done in various materials, the glass, but also gemstones and gold and so forth. This description suggests a focus on light and its metaphysical and aesthetic properties. So, for example, Otto von Simpson, in his famous study of the Gothic cathedral, drew on this metaphysics to suggest what he thought Gothic architecture was about. Quote, in the aesthetics of the 12th and 13th centuries, light is conceived as the form that all things have in common, the simple that imparts unity to all. And again, quote, according to the medieval thinkers, light is the principle of order and value. The objective value of a thing is determined by the degree to which it partakes of light. And you see why I'm so startled to be surrounded by light right now, thinking about nothing but light. I'm in this light, and that's going to be significant too. And in experiencing delight at the sight of luminous objects, we grasp intuitively their ontological dignity within the hierarchy of beings, end quote. So that has been one of the ways, thanks to Panofsky's reading of Sujet and Otto von Simpson, whom I read as an undergraduate when I was taking courses on medieval architecture. Thinking about, well, what are these churches about? They're clearly about light. Well, other scholars, most notably Conrad Rudolph, who, if you're really interested in the symbolism of medieval architecture, I highly recommend his work to you, have focused on the fact that the windows were also designed with images. And Rudolph he's interestingly suggesting that all this stuff about the light metaphysics and that Neoplatonic things, and they're reading Pseudo Dionysius, but no, it's not really about the light. Rudolph has been much more interested in pointing to the symbolism in the images, specifically this lifting up in contemplation, the anagogical symbolism, which he suggests was arguably inaccessible except to, well, the monks who are sitting there singing in the choir every day. Arguably inaccessible except to the literate experts like the monks. And Rudolph is not wrong. He does have some support from Sujet in his account, suggesting, well, we've got all this light and we've got all the color going on and it's very beautiful, but I understand that, well, and this is why I'm writing, Sujet is suggesting, maybe not everybody's going to get it. So, Sujet again, quote, and because the diversity of the materials, such as gold, gems, and pearls, is not easily understood by the mute perception of sight without a description, we have seen to it that this work, which is intelligible only to the literate, which shines with the radiance of delightful allegories, be set down in writing. Okay, so now we have two layers. One, that there's that light and the metaphysical reality of the light. But now Sujet seems to be saying, but these windows are in fact exercises in scriptural exegesis. They represent the veiling and unveiling. He has inscriptions that he gives to many of the windows where he explains, for example, what Moses veils, the doctrine of Christ unveils. Though they who despoil Moses bear the law. And he has on these windows, for example, like this one, there's an image of the Ark of the Covenant up there, and he explains, on the Ark of the Covenant is established the altar with the cross of Christ. Here life wishes to die under a greater covenant. And on another window, sorry, I've lost it. He's talking about this one. You see how hard it is to see. He says, just as this bush is seen to burn and is yet not burned, so he who is full of this fire divine burns with it, yet is not burned. It's Moses before the burning bush, and Sujet is trying to suggest that there's an allegorical meaning in that image, and here I've put it in the window too, and even though we've talked about the precious materials and so forth, you need to know what the images actually are. So we have two suggestions thus far, light and the imagery itself. More recently, scholars, however, become more interested returning to what Sujet was actually talking about in his actual materials. As Herbert Kassler and John Gage have pointed out, Sujet was highly conscious of his materials. He talks about them all the time: gold, silver, precious stones, as well as glass. There's several layers of imagery of glass, and there'll be a quiz at the end to see whether you've picked up on all of them. Sujet, on contemplating the precious stones and the cross and other ornaments that he placed on the main altar, commented that he realized that in this, and we don't have a picture of that because it's gone, the church suffered a great deal over the centuries, including in the French Revolution, when many of the precious portable objects were taken and reworked. Sujet, at realizing that these ornaments that he has placed on the altar contained all the stones mentioned in Ezekiel's description of the king of Tyre, save only the carbuncle. And there's, if you know that passage, it's Ezekiel 28, and he's describing a series of gemstones. Sujet realized that he had all those gemstones on his altar, save only the carbuncle, exclaimed to himself, quote, "When, out of my delight in the beauty of the house of God, the loveliness of the many-colored stones has called me away from external cares, and worthy meditation has induced me to reflect, transferring that which is material to that which is immaterial on the diversity of the sacred virtues, then it seems to me that I see myself dwelling, as it were, in some strange region of the universe, which neither exists entirely in the slime of the earth, nor entirely in the purity of heaven, and that, by the grace of God, I can be transported from this inferior to that higher world in an anagogical manner." Again, there's this anagogy. It's the lifting up. Is it from the light? Is it from the imagery? Or is it, as Sujet is suggesting here, from the material itself? I want to think about this material a bit more specifically as a medium. Glass is the medium through which the light and iconography are conveyed. Well, what kind of medium is glass? I'm going to take a little detour into media theory and interested whether any of you are familiar with it. Marshall Mcluhan should be on everybody's lips because he was a medievalist. No, wait. Most of the time people know about him because I've been told people hear about him in journalism class and are told he's a nut. I will tell you, the main reason I understand that people say he was a nut was because he got a little mystical. That tends to recommend him to me, but there are other reasons, right? Mcluhan, in thinking about media, and you may know him from his Understanding Media discussions, argued that we should realize we're thinking about not just the content that's being conveyed. It's not just media as this conduit in the famous, okay, I'm going to start off on a footnote there, don't worry about it. Instead of thinking about media as simply conduit, it's ground, right? It's actually thinking about the ground of the experiences they create. And this is where he comes up with his famous line about the medium is the message. The medium is, in fact, the environment of our experience. It is the thing that the content travels with, but that shapes us more than anything that the actual content says itself. This is because, as Mcluhan understood, media are extensions of ourselves, our physical and sensory powers that come with, therefore, social and psychic effects. All of the things that we're surrounded by in our built environment, our technological built environment, are themselves shaping us before they're even, quote, saying anything to us, right? Before they have any message to convey, they are themselves the message. The message is the change that technology introduces into our experience. The challenge, and this is where things start feeling a little bit mystical, because how can we tell? The challenge is to recognize these effects, to see the ground that they establish. Our propensity is to focus on the figures. If you think a figure-ground relationship, right? It's like a picture on a canvas. Our propensity is always, as scholars, as actors in our present cultural conversations, to focus on the figures themselves. Mcluhan would suggest to us that we need to focus on the ground. Now, as I said, this does end up sounding a little mystical, and he became famous in the 60s and 70s because he got on television a lot, Medium, and started talking about the effects of things like rock music and clothing styles and all of these ways in which he saw the media themselves creating a particular kind of environment in his day, and everyone said, oh, he's got him mystical. I simply see him as having trained in medieval education, because that's actually what he did. His graduate work was in the trivium and the grammar, rhetoric, and logic of medieval educational practice, which got him to the place where I spend most of my time in the multiple layers of meaning in Scripture. Therefore, there's the literal sense, there's the allegorical sense, there's the moral sense, and there's the anagogical sense. The literal sense is what carries the story. The allegory carries teachings of doctrine about Christ. The moral sense says what you should do. And the anagogy is the one that we keep talking about right now, because it is the one that lifts you up in contemplation to the divine. Mcluhan was also so that's one, you need the 4 levels of Scripture. Mcluhan was also very interested in the way in which his media studies had reintersected with Aristotelian theories of cause. This is not where the quiz is coming from, that picture. And again, I can give lots and lots of references and footnotes and things like that. I'm trying just to introduce you to the ideas at the moment. In Aristotelian terms, what Mcluhan said he was talking about with the media effects was formal cause as opposed to material, efficient, or final cause. Material cause is the things stuff are made out of. Efficient cause is who makes them, like how do you actually activate the materials. Final cause is the purpose for which they're designed. Formal cause is the form, the shape. And that what Mcluhan thought he was talking about in terms of media was the shaping qualities of form and the way they carry message. It's a little hard to find brief definitions of what he thought he was doing, but this is one of them from Laws of Media, the New Science, in which he's trying to explain this understanding that he has of artifacts as extensions of our human experience and therefore themselves as message. I'll read it for you and then you can see whether you can put all these pieces together. Mcluhan argued, all human artifacts are extensions of man, outerings or utterings of the human body or psyche, private or corporate. That is to say, they are speech. They are translations of us, the user, from one form into another form, metaphors. Got all that? So, good. Artifacts are outerings of ourselves, our human body and mind, into another form, and so they are a building is a metaphor, a clothing is a metaphor. He talks in the same context about how all of these artifacts extend ourselves, our abilities in certain ways. So, for example, a club or hammer extends the forearm and the fist. That's fairly straightforward. Clothing extends our skin. A house, a building, extends our skeleton. It's like it's a carapace, it's a structure, it supports us, right? A saw, a knife, or a bullet extend our teeth for cutting, as it were. Writing, he saw extending our eyes. A cup or a bowl extends our hands as we can cup. A wheel extends our feet in motion. and so forth. Right? One of the things that's important to think about the way Mcluhan was meditating on media effects is he can see technology artifacts both extending and obsolescing our abilities. So, for example, a chair, you might say, well, okay, what does that extend? He says it extends our hands and eyes. It makes it possible to write and read and do things like that. It numbs the rest of our body. So insofar as you all are sitting down, what you have are eyes, looking at me, hopefully in my pictures, or each other. Anything else, right? You don't have to think about supporting your body while you're sitting. You can write, you can extend your hands, and it numbs the rest. And this is also very important in Mcluhan's understanding that our media extend ourselves, but they also weaken in us in other ways. So with this idea, well, what does glass extend? I've been thinking about glass all year, and I keep running into glass. This is from a glass museum on St. Louis University campus. It's upstairs in their mansion, and it's just happened to be there. And I'm like, I'm thinking about glass. It's being shown to me. I need to keep looking. The glass is in glass cases. You can get that idea, right? So what kind of medium, what kind of extension is glass? Well, recall that Sujet described the windows, the glass of the windows that he built, as sapphiriorum materia, so material of sapphire, suggesting that he thought of them as, well, gemstones. So he sees this blue glass, and he says it's like sapphires. Well, what can he mean by that? These are the sapphires in that book cover. I like that the boss has a little feet, right? So it's actually extending towards you on that book. But he's thinking about stones like these, so like sapphires. What are sapphires? Well, you think it's like, what is glass? He's compared them to gemstones. Well, glass isn't a gemstone. Are you sure? What's glass? It's a form of rock. Specifically molten rock, colored with minerals and ash. This is my lesson in how to think. Like, what is glass? It's a rock that's been fired and melted and colored. Some facts about glass. Glass technology was actually discovered in antiquity. It goes back to the 3rd millennium BC, and particularly in Mesopotamia and Egypt. I'm showing this is a Mesopotamian object. That one's from Egypt. It's made from sand with fire and takes its colors or lack thereof from the impurities in the batch or mixture of raw materials from which it is made. These raw materials are heated in a crucible or pot of fire clay, and thus you end up with the glass. To melt this sand or silica, technically, it's usually river sand, particularly in this older glass. It can be crushed quartz or flint as well, but the finest glass in antiquity was considered made from rivers. In order to melt this silica, you need temperatures that are difficult to achieve with regular fires, with wood fires. It's possible to bring the melting temperature of the silica down with the addition of an alkaline substance or flux, and it's from this flux that the early glass tended to get much of its color. So here's the recipe for glass. And I actually, these are pictures from the Corning Museum of Glass, and I highly recommend Carol White's little book that she wrote while she was at the Getty on ancient glass, which is where I'm picking up on much of the details about this. The making of glass is miraculous. It just feels like that once you've started learning about it. Here's the recipe for glass. You need silica, the river sand, an alkali, which typically is soluble salts from the ashes of burned plants, which you call potash or soda ash. The Romans also used natron, but we have it's mainly plant ash, which should also make you thoughtful if we're getting here. And lime that comes from the bits of shell in the sand. So glass is not molten rock, right? It's the sand, but it's also trees. It's burnt trees, and it's little creatures. Now you realize glass isn't just molten rock. It's all it's animal, vegetable, mineral, all together in the same substance, right? The colors come, interestingly enough, from that ash, right? The basic burning of the potash or the soda ash gives us these base colors. But in antiquity, they also discovered that you can get different colors from added minerals. Iron gives a greenish, yellow, or bluish tinge. Copper, which becomes very important, plus oxygen yields red, blue, and green. So in fact, all the base colors are the same mineral. So now we have rock, tree, animal, and mineral. Glass was considered particularly wonderful as a substance in antiquity because it's plastic, it's moldable, and when worked properly, translucent. And so it was for the first 2,000 or so years, until craftsmen in Syria, Palestine, around the birth of Christ, learned how to mold it with their breath. Yeah, hold that thought. According to Pliny the Elder, glass blowing, flatu figurae, shaping by breath, was a specialty of Sidon, modern Saida, in southern Lebanon. The earliest archaeological evidence we have for glass blowing comes from tomb caves in the Ein Gedi, west of the Dead Sea, and waste from a glass workshop found in a pool in a 1st century BC house in Jerusalem. There, the evidence is a tube with little slightly inflated ends. It's a glass tube, and so they're figuring out how to blow the glass. According to Carol White, these tubes have been heated and then pinched together at one end. Blowing a puff of air down the tube resulted in the expansion of the hot glass at its end into a bulb. This process of blowing glass developed. They try different kinds of blowpipes. We see clay blowpipes, but the process of blowing glass through a metal blowpipe was perfected by the end of the 1st century BC. And the technology traveled with craftsmen from Sidonia to Italy, Rome, Campania, and Aquileia, particularly by the turn of the century, that is, around the birth of Christ. If you've spent enough time thinking about Mcluhan and media and message, by now your mind is blown because you realize that blown glass is sand filled with living air, dust given shape by breath. God breathed, as you will, into form. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, the glory, as it were, of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. As a historian, I'm not supposed to take these things as the cause of anything, but we're doing Mcluhan, so this counts as formal cause. That in the period around the birth of Christ, we have craftsmen learning how to shape glass with their breath. Now, Mcluhan, interestingly enough, you know of him as a media guru, and he talked, I think he talked with Timothy Leary about LSD, or Leary talked to him about it. Got a bit mystical. But what was very interesting is Mcluhan tended not in his public performances on television and so forth to explain why he thought this was so important. It was because during the time that he had been studying all that medieval exegesis in graduate school, he converted to Catholicism. I think he actually grew up Methodist. I now don't remember. And what he was doing throughout his scholarly life was trying to feed this message into the secular discussion. Particularly this understanding, this medium is the message. Well, this is what he said in a conversation that he had that's published in a little collection called The Medium and the Light, Reflections on Religion. He was asked about catechism and how do you get young people these days in the 60s and 70s interested in the church. Well, he says, quote, "Isn't the real message of the church in the secondary or side effects of the incarnation? That is to say, in Christ's penetration into all of human existence. Then the question is, where are you in relation to this reality? In Jesus Christ, there is no distance or separation between the medium and the message. It is the one case where we can say that the medium and the message are fully one and the same." Look again at those windows. Window glass as an artistic medium depends on light. You cannot see the images in the windows unless the sun is shining through them, or now a light table or electric light or something. But when they're designed, the only way you can see them is in daylight. Medieval authors were, of course, very interested in this mystery and wedded, I mean, it's like the scholarship trying to figure out whether is it light, is it images, is it the material? Well, my take as a scholar of all of these things is that the medieval craftsmen were, in fact, very conscious of the layers of this anagogy and referred to this mystery of figure and ground regularly in their artistic programs, specifically in their effort to represent the incarnation. This one window here is showing Christ. But also to show the medium through which the incarnation occurred, Mary. This is where we get edgy, because you really need Mary, okay? We have a number of meditations from the 12th century that I think are very, very beautiful, but also are trying to show the mystery of the incarnation as a mystery of, the light passing through the matter, but what does it mean for Christ, in fact, to enter into the material, become visible, become incarnate? And these meditations typically focus on Mary as a light bearer, specifically as a crystal or glass. This is the Benedictine abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who described Mary in one of her sequences. Quote, "O splendid jewel, serenely infused with the sun. The sun is in you as a fount from the heart of the Father. It is his sole word by whom he created the world, the primary matter which Eve threw into disorder. He formed the word in you as a human being, and therefore you are the jewel that shines most brightly, through whom the word breathed out the whole of the virtues, as once from primary matter he made all creatures." Likewise, in a poem that we have from a prayer book from the same monastery where these windows are made, these are not showing Mary, but they're showing you a similar problem of figure and mystery. This is the Arnsteiner Gebet book, the Arnstein prayer book, again, describing what it is to look on the glass of these windows and understand this as a mystery of the incarnation, addressing Mary again. "When you have borne the child, you were free and immaculate from the community with a man. Whoever thinks this is impossible shall only have a look on the glass, which is similar to you. The sunbeams are shining through the glass. It is intact as it was before. Through the intact glass, the light falls into the house. The darkness it banishes from there. You are the intact glass where the light came from to take away the darkness from the world." In glass form, this understanding that they have of Mary as the light, the window through which Christ shone, is most visible appropriately at Chartres in this window, which Margot Fassler has beautifully described in her study of the iconographical and musical program at Chartres in this way. And a lot of what we do as scholars is say, look, look, look. I'm going to point to you, and then you pay attention. Right. This is Professor Fassler, quote, "The Christ child's body, clothed in the purple appropriate to his stature, is framed by that of his mother, whose shimmering garment completely surrounds him like a cloth halo made splendid by light." Professor Fassler spends several pages explaining what's going on in this window, and it has very interesting relationships with the liturgy as well as the iconography, but pay particular attention to the colors. So we have this red that is like the red of the tent of the tabernacle in Exodus 26. So Mary is tabernacle-like. She's the tent where Christ becomes visible. And the blue, which is, as Jade had pointed out, like the sapphires, specifically the sapphire pavement before the throne of God, which appears in Exodus 24. So, quasis opus lapidus saphirini et quasi caelum cum splenen est. The sapphire makes Mary heaven. So how does this insight about glass change our understanding of church architecture? Well, a building, like other extensions of ourselves, is symbolism incarnate. A church, even more so. As we're surrounded by metaphor of our technology, but churches are obviously purposefully built as metaphors. To ask what is a church is to ask what is Christianity, which I argue requires us to think about Mary. Here's where things get truly complicated. We have a hard time with thinking about Mary. Visiting Chartres at the turn of the 20th century, Henry Adams, famous as the first medieval historian at Harvard and American historian and traveler in Europe, and oh yes, he's there in Paris in 1900. Henry Adams wrestled with the images that he found in the glass, and this is the way he describes Chartres, which you're looking at, in his account of what he's looking at in that iconography. Quote, "A child's fancy, a toy house to please the Queen of Heaven." That's his verdict. "Unless you can go back to your dolls, you are out of place here." Well, okay, to be fair, Adams was writing what he said was a travel guide for his nieces or those who want to be nieces, but he was also quite serious. Chartres, he told himself or was thinking about, had windows because it was built for a queen who loved color. To understand the church, one needed, quote, "only to consent to feel like a child." There was nothing of theology here, Adams insisted, only a fullness of emotion and taste, quote. "Indeed, you might find much amusement here in searching the cathedral for any distinct impression at all of the Trinity as a dogma recognized by Mary." I think those people in Puerto Rico were talking to Adams. Given that Adams was a Unitarian by upbringing, he arguably meant it as a good thing that he could not find the Trinity at Chartres. But his insistence on seeing Mary primarily as an expression of religious feeling rather than doctrine has tended to stick, at least in the general American culture. Mary and her influence on medieval church architecture could only come, arguably, at the expense of metaphysics and dogma. And yet, Adams, he's famous for this Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres, his account of the iconography that he misunderstood at Chartres. He's also famous for the chapter in his On the Education of Henry Adams, where he compared Mary to an electric dynamo that he saw at the Great Exposition in Paris. It's a very interesting chapter, and he's been taken by one of his friends to here. This is the electricity hall at the Great Exposition in Paris, and he ends up sort of mesmerized by these spinning wheels of the electric dynamos, so much so that you'd want to start to pray to them. And then he goes on his tour of the churches around the region and says, but the Virgin, she was a force like the electric dynamo, but, quote, all the steam in the world could not, like the Virgin, build Chartres. Well, as Marshall Mcluhan also famously put it, the electric light is pure information. You see now why I was so stunned. I can't see because of the lights. It's clearly information for me of some sort. This is, in understanding media, Mcluhan starts thinking about, well, look, we are surrounded by a very powerful technology, electricity, and we've been surrounded by it since the mid-19th century. I mean, Adams goes to Paris and then Chartres and is overcome by this power of the electric, the colored lights. They were projecting colored lights on the exhibition hall in 1900. In Chartres now, they do these light shows where they're projecting onto the building. We are surrounded by a light media that is incredibly spiritually powerful. And the electric light, as pure information, we don't notice it unless it's literally shining in your face. and then you're sort of, all information gets blotted out. But otherwise, what is it? Well, Mcluhan again, quote, "The message of the electric light is like the message of electric power in industry, totally radical, pervasive, and decentralized. For electric light and power are separate from their uses, yet they eliminate time and space. They eliminate time and space factors in human association, exactly as do radio, telegraph, telephone, and TV, creating involvement and depth." Glass and light, light and glass. How much is our modern inability to see Mary as an effect of the medium through which we see? And I only take this, maybe you all are really devoted to Mary. I just take this from the interminable arguments I end up online, electric, digital, about the significance of Mary in Christianity. And it's also a reflection of my thinking about her, having grown up without her in my devotion, that I grew up Presbyterian, I'm now Catholic. How do you get from the light on the outside of the building to the light on the inside of the building? Well, the great Merovingian poet Venetius Fortunatus wrote in the 6th century about the church as filled with light, like Mary, quote, "Full of radiant light, the church imitated Mary. She enclosed light in her womb, it enclosed day." So my undergraduate professor of medieval art history, Catherine Brown, I was at Rice University, therefore I was surrounded by architects, liked to say, and I was actually taught, this is Houston, she was actually talking about this in a class that we did on medieval Gothic architecture. So Professor Brown, the other one, liked to say that modern skyscrapers were the Gothic cathedrals of our day. Great towers of glass, their walls disappearing into windows. She was, of course, thinking about Houston in the day, and we have there one of the great Philip Johnson buildings, which has a elevation that looks sort of, neo-Gothic, as it were. But she was also thinking about the way in which the glass giant buildings of the day do nothing but reflect the sky. And she always used to say, well, the medieval architects would have loved this because you have nothing but a skeleton that you put glass on and they disappear into the windows. Well, much as I enjoy this image, I'm no longer convinced that she was right, or perhaps more accurately, she may have been right, but for the wrong reasons. Okay, I know, meta, right? Or I should say Joycean. I've been reading a lot of Finnegan's Wake. Mcluhan was a great reader of Finnegan's Wake. It all comes round in the river run. You'll get that if you know Joyce. Thanks to the electric light, modern Christians, along with everybody else, experience light as something that comes forth from buildings or from our computer screens, and only incidentally as sunlight, which we block out with curtains. And yet, perhaps ironically, or I should say predictably, it's electric light and now the internet that has brought us to a media environment closer to that which Christians experienced in the Middle Ages, precisely because our current environment is so encompassed by glass. We're surrounded by fiber optic cables. We're surrounded by glass everywhere. And we are constantly being interiorly lit by those devices. As Mcluhan observed in his own day, medieval studies was experiencing a boom, this is 60s and 70s, among the young, longing as they were to, quote, be absorbed into the light. In his phrasing, at the speed of light, the inner trip is all that's left. And again, as Mcluhan observed, it was characteristic of medieval experience to encounter reality, quote, as acoustic, intuitive, holistic, that is, global and total. He also uses the phrase mosaic, so mosaic, multi-layered, and cross-patterned, much as we experience the hyperlinks of the internet, which is precisely the experience Suger set out to realize in his rebuilding of Saint-Denis. Note the dedication of the upper chapel of the choir, which I'm showing you now, although this is not his glass, it's 13th century. The dedication of the upper chapel of the choir was, quote, most beautiful and worthy to be the dwelling place of angels, and therefore it was dedicated in honor of the Holy Mother of God, the Eternal Virgin Mary, of St. Michael the Archangel, of all the angels, of St. Romanus, who rests in that very place, and of many other saints whose names are inscribed there. It's dedicated to Mary, the Mother of God, to start with. This I did not realize until I was preparing for this talk. I just thought Saint Denis was Saint Denis, and Chartres, that one's the church for Our Lady. No, the churches, all of these Gothic cathedrals built in this style. Notre Dame in Paris, I'm sure you paid attention to that when it burned. Did you pay attention to that? It was Our Lady that burned. There's a tendency in much modern scholarship to take such dedications for granted. We'll study more about Saint Romanus than we will about Mary. Of course, many churches were dedicated to Notre Dame, while ignoring, like Henry Adams, the theological reasons for such dedications. It's easier, curiously, now for us to see all the other saints than it is to see Mary. A little like the way in which scholars can ignore Christ, by the way. Remember what Mcluhan says about the medium as ground. We are here on the ground of the world created by Christ. We don't pay attention to that as much as we might. To conclude, I'll then take you on a little tour of those windows again. So now the problem I say, Mcluhan came to his understanding of the anagogy of environment and material by way of his study of medieval education and practices of exegesis, which meant he had to get practiced, as most modern Christians are not, in seeing the New Testament through the windows of the Old Testament, as it were, and seeing the veil of the truth lifted from the stories that were in the Old Testament. And that's what these two windows, which the windows survive and Suget's description of what they're about survive. And therefore we can get a taste of what it's like to be thinking in this anagogical reading while looking at the glass that we now understand as living breath, which now we understand carries the light of the incarnation. So he talks, for example, about in this Ark of the Covenant window. It's that one. So we're going to talk about that image there. It's Paul taking the flour out of the bran with the mill. So he says, by working the mill, thou, Paul, takest the flour out of the bran. Thou makest known the innermost meaning of the law of Moses. From so many grains is made the true bread. Without bran are in the angels perpetual food. This is what Moses veils, the doctrine of church of Christ unveils. They who despoil Moses bear the law. That in order to see Christ, we go through the scriptures and we go through the Old Testament in order to see the truth in the New Testament, which is what is going on in that great Ark of the Covenant image. And I read this scripture, this inscription before, but I'll read it again now, and you'll see it again. On the Ark of the Covenant is established the altar with the cross of Christ. Here life wishes to die under a greater covenant. And you'll see there's the ark itself, but it's surmounted by a green cross. So there's the ark carried by the chariot with the 4 evangelical animals. The evangelists carry the truth of what the ark is, and the ark carries the truth of the crucifixion. See there, and that's Christ. Likewise, in the other window, we have a representation at the top of Moses lifting up the brazen serpent in the desert. And a window showing different ways in which Moses' own life reveals the truth of Christ. So at the bottom, Moses in the ark is that man-child whom the maiden royal, the church, fosters with pious mind. This is going up the top. Okay. In the second one, just as this bush is seen to be burned, yet is not burned, so he who is full of this fire divine burns with it, yet is not burned. What baptism does to the good, that does to the soldiery of Pharaoh, the Red Sea, a like form but an unlike cause. After the letter has been given to Moses, the grace of Christ invigorates it. Grace giveth life, the letter killeth. And then at the top, just as the brazen serpent slays all serpents, So Christ, raised on the cross, slays his enemies. These are the windows that then Sujet returned to describing their color. Now, because these windows are very valuable on account of their wonderful execution and the profuse expenditure of painted glass and sapphire glass, we appointed an official master craftsman for their protection and repair. So what was the message of the glass? I've tried to suggest to you that we need to think about these things not simply in the light metaphysics of the pseudo-Dionysian Neoplatonism, not simply in the symbolism of the imagery, not simply in the understanding of their media, but all three, that it's the light through the glass, it's the images in the glass, and it's the medium, because ultimately, this is the message. The law comes through Mary and gives us the gifts of the Holy Spirit. There's Moses being given the tablets. It comes through her in the incarnation. And here we see Christ on the top of the tree of Jesse in his birth, surrounded by the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So I'll say maybe my Professor Brown was right after all. There is something about the Gothic in our skyscrapers, but maybe precisely because they reflect the sky. Thank you very much. These lights are really bright. You didn't say anything. You should be more expressive of your media environment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown. Questions?
I'll go back to something medieval. That's Chicago, and it's the best picture I had of a blue building. It is. It's very blue. We can argue about commissioning of buildings later.
Do you find that like more modern takes of stained glasses in churches carry the same symbolism as they did then, or have like modern renditions of stained glass kind of lost all that as well?
So the one image I have, I don't know how to skip through these in the way that I would do on my own iPad. The one image I had in there is from St. John Cantius. And so when I was laughing about the effect of Prague to Chicago and why he got kicked out, Chicago in the early 20th century is its architectural boom for churches, and St. John Cantius is one of them. That they have the stained glass now instead of just the blue and the copper-colored glass. All of this glass is the greens, the blues, and the reds in the 12th century glass are simply from air. It's the oxygen that's introduced into the batch that turns them different colors, that you end up with those colors. But the stained glass, you can have more clearer glass, and I think I'd need to meditate on the sort of the color effects that you get with that stain process, which would be different from the color effects that you get with the copper process. On the other hand, if you're in a church now, I mean, the Neo-Gothic, I was noticing in some of the Puerto Rico buildings, that one had glass, that one had glass, that one had glass. I think it's still deeply embedded in our expectation of churches that it matters that you're inside it. It matters that you come into the sanctuary, the nave, and you are part of the church when you're inside the church. And I wish you had pictures, but that we're in a building that you only get the color onto you who are the church. So I'd say the medium is still there carrying the message, even with the different colors and designs and things. And so Mcluhan tends to win most of these. And consider that you are inside a building now that is colored because of that light, and you're the church inside the building.
More questions?
Yes, my question is that you seem to talk about the mystical with a little bit of a pejorative way from Mcluhan, and I was wondering if you could, I feel like your awesome presentation is somewhat mystical, and I was wondering what your take on the mystique is.
I love it. No, I'm fighting my colleagues, typically. I love Mcluhan. I think he was incredibly insightful, and what I'm saying, the thing that I've been told that he got too mystical, and I am obviously disagreeing with that. How can you be too mystical? And that I think what happened was I gave a presentation on the Draco Alchemicus, the brazen serpent, last weekend to a different audience, and someone there knew Mcluhan, and they said, "Oh, I heard about him in journalism school, but all what they said was he was a nut." And I'm like, okay, that's because, one, most people studying Mcluhan don't seem to have appreciated his medieval training, so they don't understand the layers of interpretation he was used to thinking in, thanks to his study of medieval exegesis. I think he was describing something real from the 60s and 70s. I was in college in the 80s, and that picture of Houston exploding with light was a concert I attended in 1986. It was Jean-Michel putting the lights in the building on fire. We are living in an incredibly mystical period, but we won't talk about it. And Mcluhan was trying to talk about it, and people don't want to hear that. They want to hear we're in charge of our tech. And Mcluhan would say, "No, you're not. You make it. You're makers. You're poets." But that works back on you. So, no, I agree with Mcluhan.
Any other questions from the audience?
I saw he had his hand up.
Oh, Fernando.
First of all, thank you for your fascinating presentation, Rachel.
Thank you.
Do you think that there might be a possible analogy between those stained glass windows in Gothic cathedrals with the human soul from a metaphysical point of view? Is glass also somehow connected to this ethereal but metaphysical component of our human existence?
Do the windows connect to the
is
soul?
there an analogy?
Absolutely, right. And that's why when I was, I've been thinking about the glass part for the last year or so, because I was asked to do a talk in Houston on how to read the Gospels. It's like oral and spoken, and I got interested in this. What media are we affected by when we're in the reading process? And the glass, all this past year, I was saying, it's light, it's like the electric light and stuff. And then when I started looking at the processes by which it's made, so it's molten rock, and that's cool. But the glass blowing is contemporary with Christ. I just like, okay, that can't be, that somehow not an accident, right? It's like the media itself is created by human breath. It's soul-born. It's very interesting. Now, modern glass, there's a major transformation in glass technology in the 17th century. And I'll say, where does modernity come from? Guess what? In the 17th century, the Venetians learned how to roll glass. So you get big sheets of glass, which then creates, for example, at Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors, because they're able to make these giant sheet mirrors. Maybe modernity is an effect of all that mechanical glass rolling. In the Middle Ages, the medieval is when the glass was still soul, infused with our actual spirit, potentially. Then you have to worry, and then you start realizing you have to worry about how your stuff is made, not just what it symbolizes to you. It's like if all of this is probably, I'm guessing, machine rolled, which will then create a different, and Mcluhan would say, would create a different actual environment that is your ground, that you're no longer, those skyscrapers, I'm playing with my slides to show you different pictures, let's see. All those skyscrapers, that glass is obviously not blown, therefore they're going to have a different feel to us than this glass, which was blown.
First of all, I want to say thank you for your presentation, and I found it very interesting, not knowing too much about the history of windows, but I've always been fascinated with even Thomas Kincaid and the light that he would display in his artwork. But something more contemporary is our own prayer room here at Judson. My son and his girlfriend back in 1975 were both killed. They were students here, and they were both killed in an accident. And a stained glass window was made by one of our professors plus a friend of his. And the symbolism was beautiful. As my husband was leaving campus the day our son was killed, he saw our sun mark on the side of the hill as you're going past the side road here out of the campus. And it used to be more wild. It's very manicured now. But he was sitting there and weaving a crown of thorns for the prayer meeting that he was going to be leading that night. And my husband happened to go by and said, "Mark, what are you doing?" And he said, "I am weaving a crown of thorns." And we have that crown of thorns in our home. But the stained glass window has a crown in it, and the crown is symbolizing Mark making that on the eve of his death. And the flowers that you see symbolize his girlfriend. That was a youthful, beautiful, vivacious person. And something was made in your comment about you have to know how to the materials surrounding the window. For instance, this building was rather new and it settled, so the glass was popping out. And so a new window was made, and we were given the old window, which we used very beautifully in our home, reflected from many angles. But so this was very meaningful for me, and I thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I have nothing to add, but God bless you. Thank you. I'm glad that it helped you see even more in that beautiful window for your son and his girlfriend.
If any of you have not been to Dubuque, Iowa, in Old Town, there's a Methodist church there that it's an old church, and they have beautiful stained glass windows depicting different parts of Christ's story. And there's a handful of people now attending that church, and they're taking time to clean them, and it's very expensive. But it's beautiful if you happen to be in that area.
I too would like to thank you very much. You're perhaps one of the most articulate speakers I've had the pleasure of hearing. So a question that I have for you, with your passion and your perspective on stained glass, have you taken up making stained glass pieces yourself? And if you haven't, may I please encourage you to do so? Because I, for one, would like to see very much what you create.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm a word person. I'm making poetry, which is what I was talking about last week. You know, we have a poem based on the brazen serpent, but I have an artist working with me. So yes, the arts feed each other very much so. I think I won't do glass, but I don't know. I wasn't doing poetry a few years ago. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Any other question? Yes.
I'll echo my colleagues' compliments and thanks for your speech. It's so interesting to think about the stained glass as the physical, the incarnate, right? Taking daylight, which we can't see unless it passes through the medium, as this kind of incarnate symbol of the divine. So that's in Gothic churches, and we have a bunch of students here who are learning to do architecture with contemporary churches. And the way, as you mentioned, that light gets expressed in contemporary churches is projected on a screen or shown like directly into your eyes, so you can't even connect. Do you have any thoughts on that, and what does that mean for the mystical engagement with the divine and the way we experience light in churches now?
Be conscious of the ground. And that was what Mcluhan was trying to do. What's interesting about Mcluhan was he can end up being poo-pooed because he was too mystical, but also considered sort of retro, like he just wanted to go back to this, that, or the other. What he wanted people to do was be conscious of the media environment that we're in now. And you're saying the electric. I mean, I was in college in this, in the early '80s, and I guess I still dress like a hippie, but that I was drawn to this idea that he's saying the young people in his day, the students that he knew from, he was at Toronto, were all dressed in what he called international motley, because they're just like in all patterns and all colors, and you think about that we're in the most amazing media environment right now, and so to say, oh, look at the Chartres and go back and make those. That is part of our environment because the buildings are still there, but we are also in this, we're not even in the internet environment, the electric environment solely now, we're in the internet environment, which creates all sorts of other layers of meaning. What Christ did, and this is me rather than Mcluhan, but he got me there, is entered into our media experience. And Mcluhan, he's famous for pointing out the effects of printing and then what happens with the electric. He starts with the alphabet. And he starts with, the alphabet created empires. It's actually an instrument of coercion and control. Oh, we all want to learn to read, right? Why? So we're already in the alphabet. Christ enters into all of this at the center of the Roman Empire, at the center of its road system, at the center of its papyrus-commanded, killing machine, and is the Alpha and the Omega. That we, as Christians, we are transforming the media that we're working in, and I think that sort of the blown glass, I can make that mystical and say, oh, that's cool. It's invented in the same place Christ lived, but that is what we do as Christians. We enter into, you do the glass metaphor. We enter into the mass and color it. So it's not so much that I obviously love the medieval architectural style. St. John Cantius is not a medieval church, it's more Baroque style, but of the early 20th century. Make beauty, right? If we craft through Christ, we make beautiful art. That's what I say. And if you're doing it on the internet, if you're doing it with your modern materials, be conscious of our incarnate reality.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question. I had the experience of traveling to Santiago de Compostela in late May with a group of students, and we entered the cathedral. They have an area in front of the portico that you have to enter through the museum. And we had a moment of silence in the portico of the cathedral, trying to interpret what was in front of us. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to the students is how in front of us in that cathedral there was a language that was lost to us. And made me think exactly of what you have been doing here with us, that task of doing an exegesis of the glasses, of the architecture, interpreting it for us. But when this was done, a lot of the language and the symbols was known to many of the people who were doing it or seeing it. So there is something about the exegetical task, about the actual message, in which if you don't have it, it's like it is lost in the medium. What do you think about that? I mean, it's like without that exegetical task, without the articulation, the logos, the message, it is lost to us what we have in front of us.
Yeah, so I agree. If you can't read, you can't read. That, I mean, so I'll lean on Mcluhan again to say it's going to have a message regardless. I mean, like stone, when you were talking about they're building in concrete, I'm like, oh, concrete, right? What kind of message does concrete carry as opposed to carved rock, as opposed to steel girders and so forth? So one, the first step is recognize you're already affected by it. There's already a message in there. But with the specific iconography, so Conrad Rudolph, who I talked about being much more interested in Suget's iconography, Rudolph himself has written some wonderful studies of Saint-Denis, but also of Hugh of St. Victor's mystical ark, which doesn't exist anymore. It's like it was a painting. He said Hugh gave lectures off of it, and it was like many layers. And you can see I love pictures, and I'm going to show you pictures, and I need to think in pictures. I think Rudolph is underestimating the knowledge of the people at the time. I mean, Suget says only the literate would understand it, but I think these pictures in the glass, let me see if I find a picture. Where am I in my slides? That's the Jean-Michel Jade concert, which was very cool. And you see pictures projected on there. You recognize the moon and the astronaut. It was right after the Challenger blew up, and the person memorialized in the concert was supposed to be playing in space, but he was dead, so they remembered him through the... We know these things, right? We know these references. Likewise, I think it's highly likely that people looking at these windows would recognize the images. You read. If you're on the internet at all, you've seen memes. And they may be a little arcane, and they may have references, you know what they mean. We are still in this world. I mean, that's what's funny about the way we divide up what counts as scholarship and what counts as current culture. We should be conscious of it because we're alive now as carrying messages that are both... It's like the memes travel in the digital world. They only, the NFTs only exist because you buy the digits. I don't even know how that works economically. That we're surrounded by imagery like this ourselves, and we know how to interpret it. My answer to you is we should be more conscious of that as well. Like, think about all those billboards that you passed on your way here. Those are the images like the ones that instead they were putting on church doors. I think we should have more church door imagery on our billboards than ads for hair growth. I mean, it's like there was right outside of O'Hare. You guys must see these every time you come home, right? It's like hair growth, hair growth, hair growth. Like, what message is that? Right. So I'd say take your puzzlement at their imagery, and obviously it's a delight to me to recognize the richness of the Christian understanding that these images carry. But then it should make us weep for the poverty of a lot of our public imagery, I think. And we should have that on a billboard, in glass or in digital or something, I don't know. And it would change the sense of what that means as well. But the other thing that's happened, obviously, is thanks to the electric digital media, artistry exists. That with the slide projectors in the 19th century, suddenly you're able to compare things, like put pictures side by side like I was doing. We now can do this, that I can spend, some time on the internet, pull up lovely pictures that people project them for you, that you can see them in light and so forth. We're in this incredibly rich image world that we're not always being mindful of. Maybe mindful not. We're not worrying about the anagogy that it's giving us, which it's going to.